Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you're having a wonderful holiday. Because this show deals with wildlife and the outdoors, I try to come up with a topic today that would match the holiday. Reindeer. Or at least our more local equivalent, caribou. They're actually the same species. By the end of today's show, we'll try to answer the question of whether you could tie 8 tiny caribou to a sleigh. Because reindeer are domesticated.
They certainly are, and they still are today. They're a semi-domestic animal in northern Scandinavia and parts of northern Russia, where they're herded by peoples who have been maintaining herds of reindeer for hundreds and hundreds of years.
This is Bob Duchesne's Wile Maine. Because this is a holiday weekend, many regular listeners aren't going to hear today's show. It's too bad. It's one of the best. Mark Mccullough is the endangered species biologist in Maine for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. But you might know the name better because you've got his artwork on your car. Or you might know him because he was in charge of trying to reintroduce caribou back into Maine almost 30 years ago. That's one of those stories that never gets old in the retelling. But I'll bet there's a lot of details you never knew about caribou in Maine or the Caribou Reintroduction project. You might know that caribou were native in Maine until we accidentally eliminated them all. You might know that the Maine forest has changed a lot since we shot the last one. But how does that change things now? You're about to find out from the expert, Mark Mccullough. Bob Duchesne's Wile Maine is brought to you by Hammond Lumber, Napa Auto Parts, and EBS. Welcome, Mark.
Oh, it's wonderful to be here, Bob.
You're the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Endangered Species Specialist for the state. What's that mean?
Well, it means that I've spent my entire career pretty much working on species that are rare in Maine and need a little extra help in trying to recover their populations. So I've worked for the state of Maine Inland Fisheries and Wildlife for about 13 years, and I've worked for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service here for about 14 years, doing that type of work, trying to recover species that are on both our state and federal endangered species lists.
Must be a bit of a challenge to have to deal with species that barely exist anymore.
It is, yeah, it is a challenge because each has their own unique natural history. Each has their unique threats and challenges in trying to bring their populations back. So we work on everything from Canada lynx, a larger mammal, to recently the rusty patch bumblebee. So you could imagine there's quite a lot of difference in the biology between some of those species and the things you need to do to try to recover their populations.
Rusty patch bumblebee. I had forgotten that was even endangered, but how often do you see them these days?
Well, it's proposed for federal listing, and that could happen within the next year or so. And we have them here in Maine, and the last they were seen in Maine was about 2009, right near where we're doing the interview here, right across the river in Stockton Springs. So we have a lot of work to do to get out and try to see if we still have populations of the bumblebee here in Maine.
Although this show isn't dedicated to that, I'm still dying to know, how are you going to do that?
Well, with a butterfly net. Actually, the state of Maine has, Inland Fisheries and Wildlife has an innovative bumblebee survey, citizen science bumblebee survey that's going on right now. And people all over the state have volunteered to go out and swing butterfly nets and capture bumblebees, freeze them, and then send them off to an expert to have identified. And that's how we're learning a lot more about how these pollinators are doing in the state of Maine.
Oh, man, I'm out of the loop. I knew they were in butterflies and dragonflies. I did not know about bumblebees.
Yeah, an idea for another show.
I think I smell one, yep. Well, before we go any further, I got to point out that, yes, this Mark Mccullough is the same guy who does the license plates. So
yeah,
people are going to wonder.
I served my time in prison and made lots of license plates.
So you did the artwork for at least 2 of them, right?
For 2. Yeah, for the loon plate, which the funds go to conserve wildlife here in Maine, including endangered species. And the standard issue chickadee plate I did the art for.
So you are a wildlife artist as well. And I see you at the Sportsman Show, Eastern Maine Sportsman Show every year. But there's always a line at your booth, so I never stop.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's a lot of fun to do that. Although it took me some time to get used to painting in front of a crowd of people.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
I would think you get into a zone where you're not paying attention.
Well, that's what I have to do. Yeah, I get into my zone.
All right. Well, the purpose of today's show is caribou because it's the closest thing we have to reindeer, and I'm wondering, what's the difference between caribou and reindeer?
Well, there really isn't that much difference. Folks in Northern Europe call these animals reindeer. Here in North America, we call them caribou. They are different subspecies between here and Northern Asia. So reindeer tend to be a little bit smaller, shorter legged than the caribou that we have here in North America. But they're really very similar species.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, that's the question, I guess. Are they the same species but different subspecies? And we'll get into what that means.
Yeah, different subspecies. Mm-hmm.
So essentially, they're the same thing, but in terms of species, but as a subspecies, there is dissimilarities as you go across the planet.
Right, and we even have some small caribou here in North America as well. The Grants and Perry subspecies of caribou are quite small. They're found the furthest north on some islands in northern Canada, and they would resemble what we'd think of as reindeer in Europe, being smaller. Well,
the attempt to reintroduce caribou to Maine seems to have held a long-term fascination for people in Maine. It was quite the thing back when you did it. I mean, you were in charge of the project.
Yeah, it was my first job out of college, and a real trial by fire, I would say.
Yeah, you talked about caribou at all, and that always comes up. I mean, people remember that very fondly, as I do. I mean, that was fascinating at the time because, darn it might have actually worked.
Yeah, it was a fascinating job and opportunity to learn a lot very fast about wildlife management and restoring species and what it takes to restore a species that we've lost. Some real lessons learned there, and also how to work with the media to talk to to radios, televisions, newspapers, and so forth.
Yeah, those people are just dangerous.
Yep.
So, I want to get into this whole lessons learned thing because, and we'll do that later on in the show, but I guess what fascinates me is you can learn a lot from success, but you learn a lot from failure, too. And a lot of the stuff that was attempted then probably had not really been tried on this kind of level before, so you're bound to learn things.
Yeah, so that's the way that was the premise of the project is to set it up as a scientific experiment. Let's learn what we can, if it works, why it works, if it fails, why it fails. And I think we succeeded in doing that. Of course, we all wanted it to work, but we learned some reasons why it's difficult to restore caribou to parts of their former range, and we learned that environments change over time. So Maine today is not the same Maine that we had back in the early 1800s. Times have changed, the environment's changed, the forest has changed, and so when we reintroduced caribou into our newer environment, we found out that they had real difficulties. Mm-hmm.
My guest is Mark Mccullough, endangered species biologist for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Mark was barely out of grad school when he drew the short straw and ended up in charge of the Caribou Reintroduction project in the late 80s. Up next, what was that project exactly? And what was the natural history of caribou in Maine before we shot them all? This is Bob Duchesne's Wile Maine on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. It's Bob Duchesne's Wile Maine on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. Mark Mccullough is the endangered species biologist for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. In 1986, he was put in charge of a project to reintroduce caribou to Maine. We used to have a lot of them, but the last one disappeared in 1908 up around Katahdin. That's well back before there was a Baxter State Park. The woods have changed a lot since then, so we should talk about what they were like back then. First, though, Mark, what was the project?
Well, the project... Of course, the goal was to restore woodland caribou back to Maine because they were native here. And it was an interesting concept. It came about as a result of actually a doctor here in Maine who began to go around to some of the sportsman shows and talk about the possibility of restoring caribou. Of course, there had been a previous restoration attempt in 1963 that also failed. And so as this doctor went around the state of Maine, it gained the attention of Maine state government, of the Commissioner of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife, Glenn Manuel at the time, the Commissioner of Conservation, Dick Anderson at the time, and others and the ball started to roll. And it rolled very quickly to the point where they soon went to Newfoundland and talked to experts on caribou up there and gained the interest in the province of Newfoundland in participating in a reintroduction project.
Mm-hmm. So there was interest from the folks in Canada as well to expand the range?
Yeah. There have been a number of caribou reintroductions that have been done throughout the range. Woodland caribou, that ecotype, or some even call them a subspecies that live in the forest, versus the barren ground caribou that live further north on the open tundra. Woodland caribou are doing quite poorly across the country. And in fact, the only place that they occur outside of Alaska in the United States is a very small population in northern Idaho in the Selkirk Mountains. And there was a restoration attempt, an augmentation of that small herd that occurred at the same time we were doing our project here in Maine. Though that particular population is on the federal endangered species list. But Newfoundland was quite interested. They had been successfully restoring woodland caribou into parts of their own province, the island of Newfoundland, where caribou had disappeared, and been quite successful at it. So they felt generous. At that time, there were a lot of caribou in Newfoundland and some of the herds in the eastern part of the island, and they were quite willing to give animals to Maine to see if it might work here as well.
Mm-hmm. I've actually seen caribou in Newfoundland. I've seen them up in Manitoba on Hudson Bay. Which one's a tundra caribou, which one's woodland, and how could I tell the difference?
Well, the difference is primarily their behavior, and to a certain degree their antler shapes of their antlers. So the behavioral thing is barren ground caribou travel in very large herds of thousands of animals, and they migrate over hundreds and hundreds of miles during the course of a year. They go to certain parts of their range to have their calves, and then migrate in mass to areas where they do the breeding in the fall, and then other areas where they go in the winter. And their antlers tend to be much larger than woodland caribou, which are somewhat sedentary and usually stay in a much smaller area. But again, it can be a large area. It can be several hundred square miles, but they move around within that particular area.
Do they have both in Newfoundland, both woodland and tundra type?
No, they're considered to have only the woodland caribou, but if you go directly north of Maine into central and northern Quebec, they have both ecotypes up there. So woodland caribou in the forested areas in central and southern Quebec, and barren ground to the north.
Let's talk about the natural history and the main history of caribou. We did have them. How big was the herd? Where was it?
Well, all throughout northern Maine, woodland caribou occurred, and Maine's historic record is full of mention of caribou. And in fact, a good friend of mine, Bill Crone, a professor at the University of Maine. I'm not sure if you're familiar with his book, or your listeners may not be, but Early Maine Wildlife is a record of the early records of caribou in Maine, but also mountain lions, wolverines, other species that are novel and interesting to us today to know about their history. But he and a graduate student, Chris Hoving, gleaned the historic literature, the old Field and Stream, Forest and Stream magazines, the newspapers, and so forth in Maine, and gleaned all of the old records of caribou. So there's many accounts of caribou throughout northern Maine, even as far south as as here in the Ellsworth area. There were caribou. They were all through down East Maine. They seem to associate with Chimo Bog, which isn't far from where we're doing this interview. The Blueberry Barrens down east seem to attract caribou back in the 1800s. And so they were found throughout the northern part of the state.
Yeah, some of the accounts I've read indicate that they were considered to be fairly numerous, fairly common.
Yeah, and they travel in small herds, and so when people would encounter caribou, it was often more than one, and they would pursue them relentlessly. Some of these accounts that Bill Crone has documented is that they would start tracking a herd of caribou over near Greenville, and they would track them to Monson and beyond up towards Baxter Park, shooting all the way until they killed every last one of them. So that's certainly one of the reasons why caribou declined, is because there were no hunting seasons or regulations back at that time. And furthermore, you could take a caribou or moose or deer that you shot in Maine and put it on the railroad in Greenville and have it shipped down to Boston to be sold in meat markets. So with that unregulated hunting, a lot of our species, including moose and deer to a large extent, also declined in the mid-1800s.
There's a tale that just resonates all across the country about market hunting. You know, market hunting back in the turn of the, let's say, the 20th century, really, back around that period, was rampant over a lot of different species. Shorebirds got wiped out in many cases. There are lots of species of other birds that just died out because we shot them all.
The passenger pigeon.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Passenger pigeon was a big one. I mean, that was maybe one of the most numerous birds on Earth, and somehow we shot them all.
Yeah, and the bison on the Great Plains and so forth. So that ushered in a real era of conservation in the 1870s, 1880s. State fish and wildlife agencies began to be created. Game wardens were hired. Game laws were passed by state legislators. And then folks like Teddy Roosevelt and Grinnell and others came along and created the Boone and Crockett Club and so forth to conserve the species of wildlife that those people saw vanishing right before their very eyes. But it was too late for the caribou in Maine, but it certainly did help to save many other species that were on the brink of extinction at that time from overhunting.
Mark Mccullough is the endangered species biologist for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Maine. Because it's a holiday weekend, we're dedicating the show today to the nearest wildlife we can find to reindeer, which is caribou, which is really the same species. We used to have them in Maine, and they used to coincide with moose and deer. Up next, how do those guys get along? For that matter, how are caribou different? What did they eat? This is Bob Duchesne's Wile Maine on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. This is Bob Duchesne's Wile Maine, Saturday mornings at 9, Sunday mornings at 8 on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. Reindeer and caribou are the same species. There are regional subspecies, and until the beginning of the 20th century, we had woodland caribou in Maine. In the late 20th century, we tried to bring them back. Mark Mccullough is now the endangered species biologist for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Maine, but back then, he was the guy in charge of the Caribou Restoration Project. Now, I know what moose eat, Mark. I know what deer eat. Did caribou eat the same thing and compete?
Well, they do browse to a certain extent, but a large portion of their diet are lichens. Lichens are those fuzzy, hairy-looking green things that drape our spruce and fir trees here in Maine. Those are called arboreal lichens, and one of the common names for them is old man's beard here in Maine. But that was their primary food. So they have this unique ability and this incredible digestive system to be able to digest all of the strange chemicals that are in lichens. And to a large extent, that's what the woodland species depend upon. And then when you go further north, the barren ground caribou also forage to a large extent on lichens, although in the summer they'll eat a lot of herbaceous growth as well. But up there, it's called caribou moss or caribou lichen, and it just carpets square miles of the tundra in northern Canada or Alaska, and but we have little bits of that here in Maine, too. If you hike up onto a rocky ridge, you might encounter some caribou lichen there. And certainly that's something that our caribou would have fed on back in the day.
I love that stuff. And you've been to Newfoundland before, obviously.
Yeah, I've been to Newfoundland.
And you know how thick that caribou lichen get up there?
Yeah.
It's like a mattress.
Yeah, yeah.
You walk on it, it's like walking on sponges.
It's like a cushion. Yeah.
Love that stuff. Other special adaptations that caribou might have to stay warm in winter or deal with bugs in summer, what makes them different than deer and moose? Anything?
Oh, they have some really cool adaptations, but of course, like moose and deer, they have a very dense coat of hollow hair that insulates and protects them from the cold. But they have some other unique adaptations. Probably the one that comes to mind right away is their large shovel-shaped feet. And they use those feet to shovel snow to get down to the lichens, especially the barren ground caribou to the north. But those large shovel-shaped feet also help support them on the snow so they don't sink in like a white-tailed deer would, as much as a white-tailed deer would. And also gives them a good purchase on open ice. So one of their anti-predator behaviors here in Maine back in the day was to gather out on our open lakes. And that way they could see approaching wolves. And if a wolf or wolf pack began to approach a herd of caribou, of course they had all of the open lake to run and escape from the wolf.
Of course, the earth was colder then.
Yeah.
Let's say 100 years ago.
Yeah.
So getting out on a lake, that was probably frozen for a month longer than it is now, too.
Yeah. So we talk about the Little Ice Age back in the 1700s extending into the early 1800s, and that probably worked to the benefit of caribou, wolverines, other northern species that were here because of the deeper snow and less competition from white-tailed deer and moose.
So traditionally in Maine, what would have preyed on caribou?
Wolves. Caribou evolved with wolves. Wolves and caribou, that's the ecosystem of the north. So that would have been their primary predator. To a certain extent, like up in Newfoundland right now, Canada lynx do prey on caribou calves. And through large portions of their range, for the woodland ecotype, black bears are a pretty efficient predator on both calves and adult caribou.
Back when we had these populations of caribou, the woods were different, and we'll get into that. But did we have as many bears then as we do now? No,
I would say definitely not, because the woods were different. Many of the records that Bill has gleaned are from the mid-1800s, and we were just starting to log the North Maine woods at that time in a serious way. Of course, there had been some selective harvest of spruce and large white pines right through the early 1800s, but by the mid-1800s, we really started to log large areas, and this really opened up the forest and changed it in many ways. And cut down those older trees that were festooned with lichens, for one thing, but probably more importantly, opening up the woods and persecuting the wolves that occurred in northern Maine. There was relentless persecution of the wolves. They were poisoned and trapped and killed in any way possible. But that opened northern Maine to white-tailed deer. And if you look back in the historic records in the 1860s and 1870s, there was a tremendous explosion of deer into northern Maine. They had good wintering habitat still, even though there were deep snows, but large numbers of deer. And that further led to the demise of the caribou, in that deer carry a parasite called the brainworm parasite or meningeal worm, which is harmless to white-tailed deer, but when it gets into moose or caribou, it's lethal to them.
Is there a historical record of caribou in Maine? And by that I mean beyond what the sporting journals would have written 100 years ago. Do you have Indian accounts, or do you find remnants of caribou parts in middens?
Oh, yeah, you do. And in fact, they're one of the most abundant ungulates that are found in archaeological sites here in Maine. We don't have as I understand, I'm not an archaeologist, but have talked to some up at the University of Maine, and our acidic soils dissolve bone over time, so you don't find a lot of bone in archaeological sites unless it's been, as I understand, calcified or put in a fire where it's hardened. And indeed, what they've found at many sites in Maine is the foot bones of caribou. For some reason, those seem to be persist. But there's a very famous archaeological site out in the Iziskahas Valley in western Maine where they have documented a hunting camp of first peoples from thousands of years ago, let's say 10 or 12,000 years ago. Quite old site because I believe it contains Clovis points. And they were there exclusively to hunt caribou that were migrating through that valley. In fact, I recall that they found one part of a Clovis point in the campsite, but found the other half of it associated with some caribou remains at another location. So they're really able to piece together how these people hunted caribou in that valley, much the same as they did, or they still do, in the north today.
No, remind me, what is a Clovis point?
A Clovis point is a type of arrowhead that's quite unique. It doesn't have shoulder notches on it. It has sort of a groove that goes down the middle of it, and it's one of the oldest projectile points that's found here in North America.
Mark Mccullough is my guest. In the spirit of the season, we're talking reindeer today, or at least that subspecies of reindeer we call caribou. Mark is the endangered species biologist for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We used to have caribou in Maine, a lot of them. And now you're wondering how many is alive. It's all coming up when Bob Duchesne's Wile Maine continues on Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket. This is Bob Duchesne's Wile Maine on Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket. If you've ever thought that reindeer and caribou look a lot alike, you're right. They're the same, just with a few little regional variations. Mark Mccullough is the endangered species biologist for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And 30 years ago, he was the guy who led the effort to get them reestablished here in Maine. So, Mark, was there ever any estimate on how big the Maine herd of caribou was historically?
No, nobody really knows. And I would guess that it was in the hundreds or maybe low thousands of animals. The caribou populations have their ups and downs, and they cycle. In the north, in the tundra, they're thought to have about an 80 to 100-year cycle. So we don't know that there's major fluctuations in numbers. So there could have been fluctuating numbers here in Maine, but being at the southern edge of the range here in Maine, probably weren't at the same high densities that you would find in Canada or Alaska.
Yeah, that's fair enough, because we can't even estimate accurately how many moose we have, and we live with them.
Right.
People argue about that all the time. So basically, what do you think did happen to them? It's easy to blame overhunting, because that's an obvious candidate. But there's also changes on the landscape happening, too.
Yeah, so some writers at the time were, they just didn't know much about ecology back in those days. They certainly didn't know about the brainworm. And so the common knowledge at the time was that they migrated out of the state for some reason. They probably didn't. And one astute observer said, well, yeah, they migrated out of the state in front of a Winchester rifle. Yeah. So they acknowledged and knew that there was excessive hunting occurring at the time. But probably the real reason that they disappeared is the same reason that woodland caribou are having problems across their North American range, and that is changing the habitat triggers a sort of a cascade of events. So once you cut the boreal forest, which is happening throughout central Canada right now, deer and moose populations increase. We know that happens here in Maine. And then the predators of deer and moose increase, and the primary predator is wolves. So in an environment with a higher wolf population, caribou are really vulnerable. And so that's why they're disappearing today throughout much of central and Canada, is because of the cutting of the forest and increased wolf populations. And then we've talked about the brainworm parasite, and I think that had a major role in affecting caribou as well here in Maine. So I think those are probably the major reasons. Certainly the overhunting didn't help, but changing the habitat probably was the big issue.
Mm-hmm. We forget how much agriculture there was in the state back about the time the caribou were disappearing too. We cut down a lot of forest, built up a lot of farm fields, and that's a different habitat.
Yeah, so when you think of the farms that were established at that time in eastern Aroostook County, that would have all been forested caribou habitat at one time.
How much competition with moose and deer would there have been? Do they really compete or get along?
Well, that was one of the theories that we had in the Reintroduction project, is that they would get along because they have this unique niche in feeding on lichens that deer and moose really don't rely a lot on, so that they may be able to share their range with those species. And indeed they do, especially with moose. If you go up to Newfoundland, there are woodland caribou herds coexisting with a very high population of moose in Newfoundland. But so they seem to be able to coexist.
Ironically, moose was a reintroduced species in Newfoundland, too.
It is, yes.
And now they've got too many.
Yeah.
So what led to the idea of the reintroduction officially? I mean, there was conversation going on, but at some point somebody says, yep, let's do it.
Well, it happened very quickly. Joe Brennan was the governor of Maine at the time, and Glenn Manuel was his Fish and Wildlife commissioner. And so Glenn approached the governor and asked whether this is something that could happen. There was an election coming up, in fact, that fall. And so they decided that, yeah, let's do this. Joe Brennan talked to the premier of Newfoundland, and they worked out this sort of international agreement, and it seemed like a win-win for the province, who was having some difficult times economically, and they hoped that this would bring them some good publicity and goodwill from the United States. And folks here thought it was an intriguing and interesting idea to do. So things happened very quickly from that point on. By late summer, they were looking for a biologist to head up the project, and that's when I was approached and asked. I just graduated from the University of Maine, and so I agreed to do it. But then they decided that this election was coming. Actually, John McKernan was elected, different political party, so folks knew that their jobs were going to be changing down there in Augusta, and they wanted to get this done before that all happened. So they actually, within months, developed a plan to bring caribou down from Newfoundland to Maine by early December of 1986, and so things happened quite quickly. The Canadians, the Newfoundland caribou biologists, suggested that the way to go about this reintroduction was to establish a nursery herd. In other words, establish a herd somewhere in Maine, and then take the offspring and release those into the wild. And so the initial question was, well, where would this nursery herd be located? Mark, find a place fast.
And you found Orono.
Well, yeah, there was an alternative that was considered, was Allen Island, which is down off the coast of mid-Maine near Matinicus, out in that area. It was owned by the Wyeth family, the artist Andrew Wyeth and his family owned the island. And the logistics there were just too difficult to be able to keep people and caribou and have veterinarian access and so forth. So Orono was selected, and that decision probably sealed the fate of the Caribou Project, unbeknownst to anyone involved, and it manifested itself several years later. The reason was there was a very high population of white-tailed deer near the University of Maine at Orono.
You bet there is.
And there's no hunting there, in fact, or it wasn't at the time. And there were these deer pens that the university had used for a number of years for deer research, although they hadn't been used for a long time. And that was the facility that we resurrected and repaired and got ready for the caribou very quickly. But the legacy of that of deer fecal material, pellets, with the brainworm parasite infection in those pellets was there in those woods. And so when the caribou were brought from Newfoundland and put in those pens at Orono, they began to be exposed to the brainworm parasite. And we suspected this could happen, but we worked with veterinarians from around the country who recommended treating the caribou with a drug called ivermectin, still used in veterinary practice today to prevent infections from parasites like this. And that seemed to work. We never lost a caribou to the brainworm parasite in Orono. But when we released them into the wild, we think that this drug was just suppressing the parasite. It was in the caribou. They'd picked it up in Orono. And then when we released them into the wild, many of the caribou eventually succumbed to the brainworm parasite rather quickly after being no longer having access to this ivermectin drug.
How many caribou did you bring down to start this breeding herd?
So the Newfoundlanders agreed to provide up to 35 caribou, and they captured the animals from helicopters in a highly publicized event. Of course, the province had big press conferences, and folks from all over North America and the major networks came to Newfoundland to film all of this. And they immediately ran into some difficulties. Caribou are difficult. They're a sensitive animal, difficult to capture and hold in captivity. And so they immediately lost 9 animals to a thing called capture myopathy, which is just the shock of being captured and handled and so forth, and causes physiological changes in an animal's body, and they can actually die from it. So that came as quite a surprise, not only to the Newfoundland caribou biologists who had never really experienced it in quite that way before, but also to the media who thought that this would just, think there would be no animals lost in this venture.
Stuff happens.
Yeah, so things happen. So in the end, 25 caribou were readied in Newfoundland, captured over a period of several days, and then brought back to Maine via a truck and placed in the pens at Orono. An additional 3 animals died of capture myopathy from the trip down. So that left us with 22 caribou, 22 adult caribou, 2 adult stags or bulls, and then 20 cows.
Two stags, 20 cows. That's what we started with. In only a short time, that number went down to 0. So what killed them? Mark Mccullough was there for the noble experiment. He's now the endangered species biologist for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Maine. What did we learn from all this? And if caribou and reindeer are really the same thing, could we get 8 tiny caribou to pull a sleigh? Well, that's next. This is Bob Duchesne's Wile Maine on Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket. Welcome back to Bob Duchesne's Wile Maine on Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket. And happy holiday. Historically, Maine was home to a lot of reindeer. Only on this side of the ocean we call them caribou. Caribou are just a subspecies variation on reindeer. In Latin, they've got the same name, Rangifer tarandus. Today, Mark Mccullough is Maine's endangered species biologist for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. 30 years ago, he was just out of grad school and took on the challenge of getting a caribou herd reestablished in Maine. So, Mark, what killed him?
Well, all of the caribou that we released, and there were 2 years of releases, 1988 and 1989, and we released a total of 24 34 caribou into the wild. All of them died within, as best as we could tell, within about 8 or 10 months of being released. They were all radio collared and tracked every single day, so that if we got a mortality signal, we could go in immediately and figure out what the cause of death was. Mm-hmm. So about half of the caribou died from the brainworm parasite. As we described earlier, was picked, in every case, we've determined that it was picked up in Orono. Mm-hmm. There hadn't been enough time elapsed for them to have picked it up in the wilds of Baxter Park, where deer densities were far, far lower than they are in Orono. So we didn't think that they would pick it up very regularly in that environment in northern Maine. The other half was a real surprise to us, and that was that the other half of the caribou were killed by black bears. So walking into some of these events where a caribou we knew had died the day before, and we begin to approach the area where we thought the radio transmitter was, and we would begin to find pieces of caribou, or we would find black tarry scat from bears all over the place. We knew the bear had killed them, and then we would do a necropsy on the animal that once we were able to find it. Mm-hmm. But I think that was a surprise to biologists in general here in Maine, is that they did not realize that black bears were this significant of a predator of a large ungulate like caribou, and they began to wonder, well, if black bears killed these caribou that were released, could they be killing our moose or moose calves? Could they be killing deer or deer calves? And I think they do. And I think the science has shown time and again in a number of studies across the continent that black bears are quite a formidable predator. The way they would kill caribou, and we were able to sort of piece things together from these investigations, is in our dense woods, these caribou would be traveling through spruce and fir areas where there was a bear, and if the bear detected the caribou, it would attack and try to inflict as much damage as it could. Often, very rarely could they bring them down immediately, but they would just continue to dog the animal, sometimes for over a mile or two. We were able to backtrack some of the caribou and see how this happened until they finally were able to injure it enough to bring it down.
I would think this would be a challenge when you're releasing the young caribou. You know, the breeding stock stays. The young caribou are released. They haven't had time to spend with their parents in the woods learning how to avoid predators. Was that kind of issue a problem?
Yeah, that's probably very true, Bob, is that they do learn a lot from being with their mother and with other members of the herd, be able to understand which animals they can coexist with and which ones you run from. So yeah, they probably did not have that experience available to them. We went up to Newfoundland, and it's no different up there. They've had several caribou research projects going on at the same time where they had radio tagged animals, and they also were having caribou up there, wild caribou that been born raised in the wild, also being killed by bears in exactly the same way. So it's an issue that woodland caribou have to face throughout their range.
Mm-hmm. So, as I've said at the beginning of the program, you sometimes learn a lot more from your failures than your successes. So what lessons ultimately do you think you learned from all this?
Well, I think the lesson we learned is that it's a pretty difficult proposition to bring an animal back after you've lost it. Mm-hmm. The environment had changed in Maine. Of course, northern Maine is greatly affected by logging today, except for parts of Baxter Park. But a woodland caribou population would need more than Baxter Park to persist. They would need to wander over a larger area where they would encounter deer, where they would encounter high populations of bears. Mm-hmm. And so it's a difficult proposition to bring this particular animal back, and others. So I think the lesson learned to me as an endangered species biologist is gee, let's try to maintain piping plovers and roseate terns and even rusty patch bumblebees while they're still here, rather than try the very difficult proposition and expensive proposition of trying to bring them back.
Reindeer have been, I think, domesticated to some extent in Scandinavia. Were caribou ever domesticated in any way in North America?
Not to my knowledge. I've never heard of any Native American stories or history of them being domesticated, and why that occurred only in Northern Europe. I'm not sure, but they certainly are, and they still are today. They're a semi-domestic animal in northern Scandinavia and parts of northern Russia, where they're herded by peoples who have been maintaining herds of reindeer for hundreds and hundreds of years.
So the chances of hitching up 8 tiny caribou to a sleigh are pretty low.
Yeah, I think so.
Well, if anyone wants to try it, I'll come do a show about it. We've been talking reindeer today with Mark Mccullough, the endangered species biologist for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Maine. Only we call them caribou in this country. They're only called reindeer over on the other side of the ocean and up at the North Pole, where we know there's at least 8 of them, and one of them has a red nose. You might even say it glows. Next weekend's show is going to be a milestone. We'll start the new year with the 200th episode of Bob Duchesne's Wile Maine, which is brought to you by Hammond Lumber, Napa Auto Parts, and EBS. Catch it here next Saturday morning at 9 and Sunday morning at 8. And remember, all shows are archived at 929theticket.com. This is Sports Radio, 929 The Ticket.